This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 595 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Once again, the focus of the 15 Transaction Show this week is the waiver wire. Not just for Week 15, but beyond Week 15 as well. Or through the fantasy football playoffs, since that's where we're at in the season now. It's playoff time. Now, before getting into the waiver wire focused transactions this week, I wanted to remind you that FanDuel is giving you a free way to get in on some NFL action. The FanDuel NFL High-Low is a free-to-play fantasy football contest. All you have to do is build your scorecard with the teams that you think will score highest or lowest in 4 stat categories. The closer you are to being spot on, the more points you'll get. Players with the most points each week split the prize pool, and a perfect scorecard will win the jackpot. So head over to FanDuel.com today and play the FanDuel High-Low for free. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Add Rashaad Penny. So for those of you who listened to the show last week, Rashaad Penny was the 16th transaction on the 15 Transaction Show. And after that episode was released, we got more word from Pete Carroll himself saying that Rashaad Penny was going to be utilized a little bit more in that backfield this week. And that's exactly what happened. In Week 13, Penny saw 41.7% of Seattle's running back rushes. He had 10 rush attempts. In Week 14 this past week, that running back rush share number jumped to 64%. He had 16 rush attempts. And he turned those 16 rush attempts into 137 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Now, as good as Rashaad Penny's Week 14 was, his peripherals still weren't amazing. A 64% running back rush share is fine. It's something that we should go after off the waiver wire. But he only saw 1 target through the air. And as we know, the Seahawks aren't going to face the Texans week in and week out. But like I said in my column, each game is a stepping stone. Penny saw his workload in Week 13 to 14 increase. It got better. And considering he did very well in Week 14, that could continue into Week 15 and beyond. Add Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly. So Austin Ekeler hurt his ankle against the Giants on Sunday. He missed a lot of that game. And unfortunately, the Chargers have a short week this week. They're playing Thursday night against the Chiefs. That gives Austin Ekeler less time to heal up. Now, before you all panic, head coach Brandon Staley did come out and say that Ekeler was, quote, fine. But you never know what can happen with this sort of thing. I would be proactive off the waiver wire this week, especially if you have Ekeler. And my preference between these 2 Chargers running backs would be Justin Jackson, because he's been getting more run than the other backs in this Chargers offense. The other non-Ekeler backs, that is. Joshua Kelly in that game against the Giants, he did have 10 rush attempts versus Justin Jackson's 9. But Jackson was finding the field earlier than Kelly was in that game. He was seeing work on the team's second drive. And I would also expect Jackson, given his profile, to be the pass-catching back out of that backfield if Austin Ekeler's out. But overall, both guys deserve a look off the waiver wire this week. I think Kelly would play more of an early down role and Justin Jackson being a more all-around back. But again, hopefully Austin Ekeler just plays. Add Rashad Bateman. So in Week 13, the Ravens thought it would be a good idea to play Devin Duvernay and Sammy Watkins ahead of Rashad Bateman. But fortunately, things changed in Week 14. Bateman ran the second most routes for Baltimore according to Pro Football Focus. He ended up catching 7 of his 8 targets for 103 yards. Now, it's going to hurt a little bit if Lamar Jackson does miss time. But at the time of this recording, they do sound optimistic about Jackson. That's good. Regardless, Bateman should once again be on your waiver wire radar. Drop Courtland Sutton. I've been talking about Courtland Sutton a lot on this show since Jerry Jeudy returned, because things have been bad. And even if Sutton at this point has a turnaround, are you really going to start him? Are you ever going to feel confident playing Courtland Sutton in the fantasy playoffs? He's now scored 6 or fewer PPR points in each of his last 6 games. That coincides directly with when Jerry Jeudy returned from his injury. Sutton's target share per game over this time, 11.8%. And not only is the production not there, but Denver's Week 16 and 17 matchups are against the Raiders and Chargers. Those are 2 teams that rank as bottom 5 matchups for wide receivers and adjusted fantasy points allowed. So if you're not going to use Sutton this week, which you probably shouldn't given his recent production, there's no need to keep him on your roster. And as it currently stands, he's rostered in almost 80% of Yahoo leagues. That number needs to drop. Add Jamison Crowder. So both Corey Davis and Elijah Moore are now out an extended period of time. That leaves the Jets with not great wide receiver options, maybe outside of Jamison Crowder. Now, Crowder didn't lead the Jets in targets on Sunday. Braxton Berrios did. But he ran twice as many routes as Berrios did, according to PFF. And Crowder played 82% of his snaps from his typical slot position. That could come in handy in Week 15 against the Dolphins because the Dolphins have allowed the highest target share to that area of the field this season. I think overall, the peripherals favor Crowder over any other Jets receiver right now. Sell Aaron Jones. It was a really weird Week 14 for Aaron Jones. On one hand, he scored 21.5 PPR points. On the other, he carried the ball just 5 times and he only saw 3 targets. Now, the Packers offense is better at scoring touchdowns than other offenses, clearly. But if you have Aaron Jones, I think his Week 14 is a little bit scary. A.J. Dillon out-touched him 15-5 on the ground. And while most of you are probably sitting there assuming that it's because of a positive game script, keep in mind that both running backs carried the ball 3 times in the first half. Dillon did close the game, but that's also a problem. If the Packers get out to a big lead in any of these games upcoming, what's going to happen to Aaron Jones? That at least puts that doubt in your mind. And not only that, but Green Bay's schedule over the next 3 weeks, it's not necessarily very good. It's not terrible, but they get Baltimore, Cleveland, and Minnesota. The Ravens are the 3rd best team against running backs in adjusted points allowed. The Browns are top 10. Jones is one of the most talented running backs in this league. He's capable of turning things around. It just depends on how the coaching staff wants to utilize him. And with A.J. Dillon in that backfield, and A.J. Dillon's really good too, but with A.J. Dillon in that backfield, there's an obvious red flag for Aaron Jones from a usage perspective. Add Gabriel Davis. So Emmanuel Sanders suffered a knee injury against Tampa Bay on Sunday. That allowed Gabe Davis to get more action in the Buffalo offense. Up until Week 14, Davis's highest snap share in a single game this year was just 50.6%. On Sunday, it was 83.3%. And he produced. He saw 15.7% of Buffalo's targets. He converted his 8 targets into 5 catches for 43 yards and a touchdown. He now has back-to-back weeks ranking as a top 30 PPR wide receiver. Now, it sounds like Sanders is going to miss at least Week 15, but honestly, it makes sense for Buffalo to keep utilizing Davis regardless. He's been effective when he actually gets playing time. Add Kadarius Toney. So this transaction is a little less quantitative than most of the transactions. We haven't seen Kadarius Toney on a football field since Week 11. And every week that he doesn't play, he's available in more and more leagues because people are sick of rostering him. And just to be transparent, there's a chance that he doesn't even go this week because he tested positive for COVID on Monday. But think about it this way. How many players are on your waiver wire that have shown the ceiling that Toney has already shown? In Week 5 against Dallas, who he happens to be playing in Week 15, he caught 10 balls for 189 yards. As a rookie with limited action, he's seen 9 or more targets 3 separate times. And remember, guys, targets are earned. And you're right, we don't know exactly how he'll be used when everyone's healthy in this Giants offense. But what we do know is that our benches this time of year, really all year, they should be filled with players who can give us these spiked weeks that have the kind of upside that Kadarius Toney has. I think it's reasonable if you want to use your bench for high-end handcuffs, or handcuffs in general. That's totally fine, but don't forget about Kadarius Toney either. Add KJ Osborne. So I talked about KJ Osborne last week, but I want to talk about him a little bit more this week, clearly. He came through in Week 14, and that was without Adam Thielen against Pittsburgh. He caught 3 passes, but his target share in that game was 29%, and he obviously had that big touchdown too. A 29% target share is awesome. And this week, the Vikings get a good matchup against the Bears. So Osborne could be usable. He's definitely worth an add if he's still out there. Sell Chuba Hubbard. I feel like what Chuba Hubbard did in Week 14 was sort of expected. He saw 10 of a possible 14 running back rushes. He found the end zone on the ground, but he didn't get any of the receiving work. Amir Abdullah did. Abdullah had an 11.4% target share. Chuba Hubbard had a 0% target share. He's a one-dimensional running back given how they're using him in Carolina in a mediocre offense, and that's not something that you want for fantasy purposes. And what's worse is that the Panthers' schedule, as I've noted on this show over the last couple of weeks, it sucks. In Week 15, they get the Bills. That game could very quickly go south. And if it goes south, Amir Abdullah is going to be the back in that backfield. They're going to lean on Abdullah as opposed to Hubbard. In week 16, they get Tampa Bay. Not only can Tampa Bay stop running backs, but you also have the negative game script thing too. That's an issue. And then in week 17, they get the Saints. The Saints are the worst matchup for running backs in all of football, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. It's really, really, really tough to trust Chuba Hubbard, especially in the fantasy playoffs. Add Malcolm Brown. So last week, Myles Gaskin and Savon Ahmed tested positive for COVID-19. So it meant that there was a chance that we'd see Phillip Lindsay as the Miami lead back in week 15. And their week 15 game is against the Jets, a team that's allowed the most adjusted fantasy points to running backs this year. But then on Monday, Phillip Lindsay also tested positive. And it sounds like Malcolm Brown could return from his injury this week. So if the other backs in that backfield happen to not be back in time, Malcolm Brown could get a shot to be the lead back. Now I'll say this, in most cases, I probably wouldn't care that much about this backfield in this situation. But because of this opponent, there's a chance for usability from the backfield. And as a result, if you're using a free agent budget, I think it's worth throwing $1 or $2 at Malcolm Brown this week. Let's just see how this thing shakes out. Add Justin Fields. So over Justin Fields' last 3 completed games, because remember, he got hurt against Baltimore, he scored 25.3, 18.1, and 18.4 standard fantasy points. And what's boosting his numbers, finally, is his rushing. He's doing more work on the ground. Across his first 5 starts, Fields was averaging 4.6 rush attempts and 21.2 rushing yards per game. Over his last 3 finished starts, his rush attempts per game rate has increased to 9. His rushing yards per game is 74. Now he gets a Vikings secondary that ranks in the top 5 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. I think that Justin Fields this week is the top streamer. Add Jimmy Garoppolo. I like Jimmy Garoppolo a lot too. The 49ers get the Falcons, and according to FanDuel Sportsbook, San Francisco has an implied team total above 27 points. Garoppolo has scored 15 or more fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 games. And the Falcons are the top team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year. So he makes as a decent streaming option. Add the Philadelphia Eagles defense. So the Eagles are available in a lot of leagues after their week 14 bye. And they have one of the best schedules for the fantasy playoffs across the board. In week 15, they get the football team. It's a team that ranks in the top half of the league as an opponent in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And Taylor Heineke is also banged up. That's not a bad thing for the Eagles. And then they get Washington again in week 17. And then sandwiched in between, the New York Giants, another plus matchup. You know, I'm not one who typically just plugs and plays defenses throughout the playoffs, but maybe you're in a league with limited waiver acquisitions. Maybe you need a defense throughout the entirety of the fantasy playoffs. If that's the case, Philadelphia does work. Hold the Los Angeles Chargers defense. Now, a lot of you listening to this show have the Chargers defense because of their week 14 matchup against the Giants. And you might be looking to swap them for another defense this week because the Chargers get the Chiefs. And you don't want to play them against the Chiefs. But do your best to hold on to them. In week 16, they get the Texans. And as we know, Houston's one of the best matchups for opposing defenses. They're the 6th best offense for a defense in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So if one of your league mates ends up dropping the Chargers because of this upcoming matchup against the Chiefs, grab them. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Amon-Ra St. Brown. The reason I didn't put St. Brown in my column this week is because I don't know how sustainable this is going to end up being. The running backs in Detroit didn't play this past week. TJ Hawkinson's been banged up as well. And let's be honest, it's the Lions. It's hard to rely that heavily on a Lions receiver, especially with the season on the line. But Amon-Ra St. Brown now has a 32% target share over his last 2 games. And he scored 25 and 15 PPR points in those 2 contests. Honestly, that type of usage is really hard to ignore. So if you need some wide receiver help, he makes plenty of sense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. You don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you tomorrow.